Tonight we have Fred Vilbig. Fred is a native of Texas. He graduated from the University of Dallas with an AB in philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, and from St. Louis University Law School with his JD. He's a Clayton-based lawyer here in St. Louis, he's based in St. Louis, but his expertise, I guess, is the estate planning. He has had numerous interviews with various people on St. Joseph Radio, and many of them can be heard on SJEN TV on the internet. He also is a seasoned Lenten speaker because he's been here before, and he's been at many other parishes too. For Fred and his wife Diane are parents of 11 children, and they are parishioners at Holy Infant Parish in Baldwin. His topic tonight is the 4 last things. Thank you.
Thank you, and for those of you who stayed, I guess that you can offer this up as part of your Lenten observances. Anyway, thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction. My name is Fred Vilbig. How did you like that weather today? It's funny, it's 30 degrees, and we think we're in Palm Springs or something. It's just beautiful. So I guess the question is, what did you do today? You got up, brushed your teeth, took a shower, you had breakfast, tried to figure out probably, what's for dinner tonight, and what am I going to do for lunch? For those of you who worked, you went and got in the car and drove to work, and then you had to worry about, what are your projects? What are your deadlines? Co-workers, that's always an exciting challenge. And so you go to lunch, you come home, come to church. Our day-to-day life is filled with a lot of things, all kinds of distractions. The radio, the TV, music, news, all of that is very distracting. And people don't take the time to really think about the eternal realities that we're going to have to face at one point. This isn't a unique sort of a problem because this is a perennial thing. One of my favorite saints is St. Alphonsus Ligouri. St. Alphonsus lived in the 1700s during a time that's sometimes referred to as the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment in France led to the French Revolution, the murder of priests and nuns. They literally took the Eucharist out of church and put a statue of reason up on the altar and worshiped that. They had a mockery of the Mass that was designed around that. And so that was the Enlightenment in France. Alphonsus lived down in Naples, and in Naples it wasn't quite as bad, but there was Naples at the time was actually ruled by Spain, and the Spanish king had appointed a man by the name of Bernard Tanucci there. And Bernard wasn't quite as extreme as the French were, but he still thought that religion was just a bunch of superstitions, and you needed to control it. Alphonsus wrote several books. He had to sneak them out of Naples and up to Venice to have them published because Tanucci would not let anything be published. He suppressed any and every religious order that he could. And of course, Alphonsus Ligouri is the founder of the Redemptorists, and he did everything that he could to stop that as well. But what Alphonsus found very successful in his preaching was he would go out into the countryside and he would preach. He was kind of scandalized in the small towns, the faith that the people found. Sort of like, I assume, what St. John Vianney encountered in ours. That he went there and people just, they really didn't know what their faith was and they didn't really practice it. So anyway, he was kind of scandalized by that. So he started preaching on the 4 last things: death, judgment, hell, and heaven. And it was a very effective way of preaching. He had a lot of people that converted, they realized the error of their ways, and they started thinking about those eternal realities. Traditionally, that's the way that the 4 last things are presented. I'm writing something on this, and my editor was reading it, and she said, "Oh, this is so depressing." And I said, "Well, don't you get to heaven?" She says, "Yes, but you have to go through death, judgment, and hell to get there." And so I'm revising how I will approach this and look at heaven first. Our society, we have all of these phones and things that we're all connected to everybody. Our society is suffering from a pandemic of loneliness, of depression. My wife works at a hospital, and she's always surprised at the large number of people who come in and they're on antidepressants. I live out in Ellisville. If you were watching the news the other night, there were a bunch of students in the Rockwood School District who on their own, they did a study, and they found that a large number of students had thought about suicide, and a smaller number, but still a shocking number, had attempted suicide. They've had 4 suicides in the Rockwood School District in the past year or so. And they were petitioning, they did a survey of the students and got these results back. And then they presented these to the school board and said, "We need to do something." Our society, I believe, presents a very bleak picture for our young people, for everyone, really. There's little hope and little purpose in our lives. So I don't want to start with death. I will start with heaven. So have you ever thought about heaven? The thing that's frustrating is in the Bible, Paul says, "Eye has not seen and ear has not heard." That's not very helpful, Paul. It would be nice if he would give us some details. He said that he was caught up into the 3rd heaven. And for a long time I thought, what on earth is he talking about? But I found something within the past year or so. The 3rd heaven is what we think of as heaven. They had the sky, and then they had, in Jewish cosmology, there was water above the sky. And then above that was heaven, and that's where God dwelt. And so he was caught up into the 3rd heaven and had a profound experience with God. But he really doesn't describe it. Like I said, he says that eye has not seen and ear has not heard the glories that were revealed. So it's a little frustrating if you try to think about what heaven is like. And John the Apostle in the book of Revelation talks about heaven, but it's almost like he's an outsider. He tells you about things that are going on, but he doesn't really tell you about that experience. So the question is, what is heaven? What is it that martyrs die for and that virgins sacrifice their lives, in a sense, their bodies for? What is this that is so great? So there are several different aspects. One is the world. This is from Romans also, there is a phrase that Paul uses saying that all of creation groans, in effect he says groans under the burden of sin. That what's happened with original sin, and I'll come back to this, what's happened with original sin is the fabric of the universe was ripped or torn or something, but it was all set a kilter. And as a result of that, what we experience around us, yes, beautiful. I love sunsets. I'm a morning person, and I get up and I'm always amazed. I look at the sunset and I think that's what God is painting for me this morning. Because if somebody is right over there, they might not see the same light refraction that I see. They might experience it differently. And so God is painting this sunset for me at that moment. And I always think that is so beautiful. There's a lot of beauty in the world, but the beauty in the world is a dim, muted reflection of the beauty that is God. And so the world that we experience is sort of muted. When we get to heaven, that veil will be pulled away, and the glory of God will shine through all of created things, and it will be beautiful beyond anything that we can imagine. Our bodies too will be renewed. We will be healthy. All of Jesus' miracles, really what they were doing was restoring what was originally meant to happen. We will be, if you look at the resurrection accounts, Jesus was able to pass through doors. We'll be able to pass through doors. He all of a sudden appeared at the Sea of Galilee, and it wasn't like he walked there, so that we'll be able to move freely wherever, instantaneously with a thought. This is kind of the stuff of science fiction. But you won't be sick. People, when you talk to them, will be immediately present to you. I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but when people are talking to you, you've got all kinds of things going on in the back of your head. You're distracted. They do too. And I don't know if you've ever met people like this, but I've met a few people in my life where when you talk to them, you feel that you are the only person in the universe. They are so focused on you. And I think that in heaven, that immediacy will be there for each one of us in all of our encounters with one another. But I don't know that all of that will be enough. Mark Twain wrote a book. It was a short story. It evidently was the last short story that he wrote. It wasn't the last one published. They found some things in his writings after he died and published them after he had died. But this was evidently the last short story that he wrote. It's called Captain Stormfield's Visit to Heaven. And of course, it's Mark Twain, so you've got a riverboat captain, and he wakes up, sort of, and he discovers that he's on a boat kind of a thing, sailing through the heavens, and there's another boat over here, and he starts to race it, and so he goes off course, and he gets to, after a long, long journey, he gets to this high wall, which is the gates of heaven, but he gets there and he doesn't understand what anyone is saying. It doesn't hit him at all. It's just, he's saying, well, what is this place? Anyway, somebody realizes that he's at the wrong gate. And so they say, to get to the right gate, you have to step on this mat and then just imagine that you're at the right gate. There he goes to the right gate. He goes in and he's so excited because he's going to get his harp and his crown, which is what everyone wants, right? And so he gets in line. It's a long line. He gets in line to go and get his harp and his crown. Well, while he's waiting in line, he sees people coming the other direction, and they're looking around kind of guiltily and taking off their crown and stacking the harp and the crown on the side. They're not really interested in it. And he thinks, well, what's wrong with them? So he gets up at the end of this very long line. He gets his harp and his crown. He says, this is great. And the crown doesn't fit right, and he really doesn't know how to play the harp, and he's walking around looking at people, and why am I doing this? So anyway, he takes it off and puts it down. And then he goes and he tries to meet some people, and everything is wonderful. They can eat whatever they want. You're not tired, you're healthy. Everything is wonderful. But he noticed that after about 100 years of that, it got boring. That wasn't heaven. And I think that's a profound truth that's in that. Heaven is not going to be merely earthly paradise. Heaven is going to be an encounter with God. God is, like I said, He's beautiful beyond anything that we can imagine. He is loving beyond anything that we can imagine. He is the most desirable person in the world. And when we die, we're going to go and be able to see him. They refer to that as the Beatific Vision. Now, I've had friends who have said, oh, that sounds exciting, sitting around for all eternity staring at God. But what you don't understand is God is infinitely beautiful, infinitely desirable, infinitely loving. And I think in heaven, with all of the perfections and the wonderful things that'll be around you and how healthy you'll be in the prime of your life. It's kind of funny. I sometimes I ask people, I say, how old do you imagine yourself to be? You know, when you're thinking, how old is your sort of prime age? And everybody's got a little bit of a different age. But, you know, you'll be in the prime of your life. Everything will be wonderful. But what will be glorious about heaven is you will be able to sit in the presence of God. Actually, when you and I were baptized, we were engrafted into the body of Christ. Christ is at the right hand of the Father above the angels, and we will be there as well. We will be there with the Holy Trinity in that beautiful, incomprehensible world, and the love of God will roll over us like waves of an ocean for all eternity. That's what we're living for. St. Thomas Aquinas has a prayer of thanksgiving at the end of Mass, and in it, at the end, he talks about this, you know, it's the place where all of our joys will be super abundantly satisfied, will be fulfilled beyond anything that we can imagine. That's what we're working for. But before you get there, you have to face death and judgment and the possibility of hell. Death, I'd like to talk about death. I don't want to keep you guys too late. I want to talk about death by telling a story. There's a saint who died in the early 1900s. Her name was Saint Rafka. She was born east of Lebanon and was her mother died when she was young. Her father remarried. Her stepmother and aunt tried to get her married, so she ran away to a convent. She wanted nothing to do with that marriage stuff. She ran away to a convent. She became a teacher in a small town that was attacked by a marauding non-Christian tribe, and she fled for her life, hiding a child in the folds of her habit. In that raid, there were 8,000 people that were killed. There were churches and monasteries and convents destroyed. It was a very, very traumatic encounter. Anyway, she escaped, and she decided that she wanted to become a cloistered nun. And she went up into the mountains of Lebanon, where it is cold. And they had a very strict rule at this monastery, this convent. And she went up there, and she was perfectly happy, except for one thing. She had a very profound understanding of uniting our sufferings with the suffering of Christ on the cross through the Mass. She understood that very well, and so one night she prayed. She said, Lord, I don't understand it. I'm healthy. I don't have any complaints. I want to share in your suffering. The next night, be careful what you pray for, by the way. The next night, she had a sharp pain in her forehead, and it persisted. Her eye became involved in it. They took her to the doctor. The doctors decided that there was pressure building up, and so they removed that eye. The other eye withered, and she was completely blind. The pain spread throughout her body. She became paralyzed. She rejoiced in that, as some saints do. There are stories about how she would drag herself to the chapel for prayer, and then the nuns would have to take her back. Say, Rafka, come on. And so they'd have to take her back. When she died, her death was not so much a relief of the pain and suffering she was experiencing as it was the gateway to paradise. And let me see if I can find the quote. When she was dying, I don't know if these were exactly her last words or it was right when she was dying. She said, "I'm not afraid of death, for which I have waited a long time. God will let me live through my death." For her, death was a liberating experience, not so much from the pain, but it was an entry into heaven. Our society does not look at death that way. Our society avoids death. It used to be that when people died, it was very immediate. They would die in the home. Now, when people die, you get a phone call from the nursing home or you get a call from the hospital. And somebody you don't know says, your mom died, your father died. We're very removed from the whole death experience. In this thing that I've written, I kind of went into some details on stories of death that my editor said, that's really macabre, don't do that. So anyway, I won't do that. But yeah, we do everything that we can to kind of avoid the topic of death. We have this youth cult. You know, all of the advertisements show these malnourished girls up there, modeling things. And it's all youthful people, unless it's some sort of an ad for some prescription medication, and then they put old people in. But it's one of those things we don't want to avoid. We don't want to encounter that. And I also hear people saying, "Oh, so and so died. They'll live on in my memory." We really don't remember many people. Memory is not. It's not a real way that people live on. Yes, remember the people, pray for them, pray for their souls. But it's not that they're going to really benefit from your remembering them. The Second Vatican Council, the Constitution on, I don't remember which constitution, it's Gaudium et Spes. Anyway, they wrote this, they said, "It's in the face of death that the riddle of human existence grows most acute. Not only is man tormented by pain and by the advancing deterioration of his body, but even more so by the dread of perpetual extinction. The mystery of death beggars the imagination. Death is the great equalizer. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, if you were popular or shunned by society, it doesn't matter. Everyone dies, and we all end up dying basically alone. Even if you're in a room full of people, you're the one that's dying. There are various kind of deaths for you to look at. There's the death of some. As an attorney doing estate planning, I encounter some of these things. I've run into people who are just angry and bitter. I've run into people who are caught up in their things. I've run into people who are just narcissists. They're very fascinated with themselves. In the end, none of that matters. The death of a saint, though, is different. They're very peaceful. Even the martyrs, if you read about the deaths of martyrs, it's not that they're screaming and running from death. In a sense, they're embracing death as that gateway to heaven. So, we're going to die. We have to be prepared. And Jesus told us that. He had the parable of the land, the property owner who had a tremendous harvest, and he gathered all of his grain. He built, new granaries, everything, so that he could store it, and he was going to be comfortable for the rest of his life. But Jesus pointed out that God was going to call him to heaven that night. And you don't know when it's going to happen, so we need to be prepared at all times. And hopefully you'll view death as being the gateway to eternal happiness. Judgment it's almost, it's one of those things that is criticized in modern society. How dare you judge me? You're not allowed to judge people. It's a horrible thing for you to judge someone. Now, we all do it. That's the way you make it through the day. You know, you judge whether or not you're going to make it through a stoplight that's turning yellow. You judge whether or not this food is going to taste good. You judge, there are lots of things, encounters with people. You do judge people. So you can't avoid judgment, but it seems like in our society, I have 11 kids. The youngest are 19-year-old twins. I get a lot of direction from my children. I don't know if you get that or not, but I get a lot of direction from my children. And I get criticized for judging because I look at things from a Catholic perspective. And but the whole thing about judgment is, I don't think we are presented with the idea of God judging us and sending us to hell. I don't see God as being the great accountant in the sky, keeping tabs on what it is that you're doing. There was a murderer, actually. His name was Jacques Fesch, and he was a spoiled, rotten brat in the early 20th century in Paris. His father was a banker, and it was a broken family. He got anything that he wanted. Anyway, he wanted to try to find himself. And so what does anybody do when they want to find themselves? Yes, they go to their father and say, "Dad, buy me a yacht so I can float around the Pacific Ocean and find myself." And the dad, who had really indulged him a lot, looked at him and said, "No." Anyway, so Jacques said, "Well, okay, I'll take things into my own hands." And he had done bad at business. He had done, this kid was, sounds harsh, he was really a loser. Anyway, so he was, nothing that he ever did worked or anything. So he gets this brilliant idea to rob a money changer that was a family friend. Okay, so, he's going to go to somebody that knows him and rob him. He puts on a mask, as we all wear now. He puts on a mask, and he takes a gun from his father's house, and he goes to the money changer's office and robs him and hits him over the head and takes the money box. Well, it turns out that the money changer had already deposited his money, so there was almost nothing in the box. See, this guy was a good planner, okay? And so he's running away, and and he didn't hit the money changer hard enough. He didn't really knock him out. And so the guy gets up and goes out in the street and says, "Thief, thief, get him." And so there's this horde of people. It kind of reminds me of a Keystone Cops kind of a thing. All these people are running along, and the French gendarmes are going and yelling at him. Well, this guy's got a gun. And he's saying, "Leave me alone, I don't want him." Bam. And he shoots a police officer and kills him. And the police officer was a widower and the father of 2 young children. And I don't know if I was very fortunate with the University of Dallas. I was able to study in Rome, and I went to Paris several times. And the French gendarmes, they're really not nice people. They're, our police, we have all of these rights and everything. I watched them really beat up a guy on the street, and I'm looking around thinking, wait, isn't somebody going to do something? And it was as if this was just an average run-of-the-mill thing. So the French gendarmes were not people that you wanted to mess with, and he shot and killed one of them. So they immediately arrested him, put him in solitary confinement, and everybody knew before the trial that he was going to be killed. He was going to be put to death. And by the way, at the time, they were still using the guillotine. And so he knew that that was what was going to happen. But he was all belligerent and angry and mad. Well, there was a priest who would go by a couple of times a week and visit with him. And Jacques made fun of him for a while. But then he kind of warmed up to him because this was the only guy coming by and seeing him, and he was in solitary confinement. And then Jacques had, we don't have a good description of this, but Jacques had a profound mystical experience with God. And what happened was he was converted and had absolute faith in God, in Jesus, and he began to have mystical experiences, and his letters. There are 2 books of letters that I've read of his that are really very profound. These are letters to his mother-in-law, and very profound messages that he gave to her. Well, he made a comment at one point, and this was in connection with judgment. He said, "I heartily wish people could hear the wailing of tepid souls coming all foul and gray into the light of Christ's glory." God is light. When we appear before him, all of our imperfections will be right there for everyone to see. It will be embarrassing and humiliating to us, and I think we will judge ourselves and flee the presence of God. I don't think that God is going to cast us into hell so much as we are going to run screaming away from God. C.S. Lewis has one of my favorite lines in one of his books. He writes about how I didn't write down where the quote's from. The gates of hell are locked from the inside. It isn't that God sends people to hell. We send ourselves to hell. I was going to make a comment. This was something that I skipped over on my notes. The question of death raises the question about what's next. And the reality of death raises the question of what's next. And some people say that there's nothing. Well, if there's nothing, then life is pointless and meaningless. And I think that's one of the problems that we have in our society. The Buddhist understanding is nirvana, which is, and I know I'm butchering this, but it's sort of a peaceful, blissful nothingness. You're conscious to a certain extent, but you're really not encountering anyone. We're social beings. That sounds horrible to me. So I don't think that that's really going to be heaven. There are 2 famous quotes of people who died about their last words that I like to mention to people. Stephen Jobs, the founder of Apple, his sister wrote an editorial after he died. His sister wrote an editorial and published it in the New York Times. His last words, he looked at his sister, he looked at his significant other, he never married, his significant other, and then he looked off into the distance. And his last words were, "Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow." And Thomas Edison, he was laying on his deathbed, and his last words were, "It's really beautiful over there." Judgment will be when we face God, we come into God's presence, and if we are, and St. John of the Cross says, the judgment that we have will be a judgment based on love. It isn't like I said, God isn't an accountant up there, saying, "Oh yeah, there's 15 mortals or venial sins, and then this one was kind of serious, not really a mortal sin." I don't think that's the way God is. God is love, and he will judge us on how we've loved one another. That's the way that we will. That's the way that we will end up being judged. This raises the question of how many souls are saved. And I don't know if you've ever had the Jehovah's Witnesses come to your door, but they have the 660,000 or whatever it is, 666,000 people. That's out of the book of Revelation. Numerology was huge in the New Testament, Old Testament, and really that just meant a large number. Nobody could count that high. That's a huge number for them. The book of Revelation talks about how when the dragon, swept his tail, 1/3 of the stars were swept away. So I've had people tell me that, 2/3 of everyone will get to heaven, 1/3 will go to hell. St. Augustine, he was really kind of negative. He referred to the massa damnata, the damned masses. So I think he thought that a lot of people were going to hell, which is sort of in accord with what Jesus said, that the that the road is narrow, the doorway, the gateway that you try to put the camel through is very small, and so you need to pay attention. There was another ancient church father by the name of Origen, and he was a brilliant scriptural scholar. In many, many ways, he was a very good man, but he had some problems that were deemed heretical, and that's always a problem. That's why he's not a saint. But one of them was, and I don't have the Greek word here, but there's this long Greek word. He believed that eventually everyone would be redeemed, that that hell is not permanent, that it would be a temporary stay. But the church condemned that because Jesus is the one who talked in the Bible. He's the one who talks the most about hell. And it's not like he's talking about it as some sort of an imaginary place. He's trying to explain and communicate to people that it's a real place. Thomas Aquinas, he took sort of a middle road. And what he did was he said, you should live as if few are saved, but hope and pray that many are saved, because we just don't know. In our modern society, some of you are old enough, some of you are young. There was a song in the 60s, I think it was, maybe early 70s, and one of the lyrics in it was, I know there ain't no heaven, but I pray there ain't no hell. Well, the problem is, hell is a possibility, let's say. Society will say, well, God is too good. He's too merciful. He wouldn't send people to hell. They can't, for the people that even accept that there's a possibility of hell. But, Jesus talked a lot about hell, and there are various saints who had visions of hell. The visionaries at Fatima, they were shown a vision of hell that just for a moment, and it was so harsh that they almost fainted, and Mary comforted them. The Saint Faustina was shown a vision of hell, and her comment was, most of the people who are in hell are people who didn't believe there was a hell. She also mentioned how ugly Satan is. Ugly, ugly, ugly. Very hideous. She had an encounter with Satan and said that he was terribly, terribly, hideously ugly. One of my favorite visions of hell, though, that sounds kind of weird, doesn't it? I think one of the best visions of hell is St. John Bosco's experience of hell, really. St. John Bosco lived in the 1800s. He worked in the streets of Milan. He took in children that were at risk. There were a lot of orphans on the street then, and took them in and gave them put them in a trade school, gave them a place to sleep off the streets, made sure that they practiced their faith. But he was very, very concerned about his boys getting to heaven. And he would have dreams. He had these famous dreams. And the dreams were so famous that the Pope even wrote him and said, hey, when you have a dream, send me a note. So these dreams were very prophetic. He had a dream of hell. And what it was is you start out on this long, beautiful path, this wide road, and you're marching along, and he's got a companion with him who is never identified, but we assume is an angel. And they're going down this path. The path starts to get steeper and steeper downhill. The beautiful flowers and everything, they become, withered and become ugly. There are little strings that are across the road, and he sees some of his boys running down this road, and they get tripped up by the strings and are pulled off the side of the road screaming. And he asks his companions, what is this? And he looks at the strings, and on them they're all marked with mortal sins. And he says, well, what's down there? And so they pull on the string, and like St. Faustina, this hideous creature comes up and so they let it go and fall down. He continues down this road, and he's shown hell. It's almost like there's a viewer's platform. So he goes in, and he's able to look into hell, and there's some really horrible images of it. And anyway, as he's leaving, the angel says, do you want to touch the outer wall of hell? And he said, no, I don't want to touch the outer wall of hell. And the angel says, well, this is, the 1,000th wall outside of hell, and each wall is separated by, miles and miles. Like, if I remember correctly, it was millions of miles. So, you're so far from the fires of hell that, it's not that bad. So St. John Bosco, he said, no, I still don't want to touch it. So the angel takes his hand, puts it on the wall. John Bosco wakes up in his bed screaming, and his hand is throbbing. And the next day, the skin starts peeling off of his hand. So hell, Jesus talks about hell, and there have been saints that have had encounters with hell. Teresa of Avila, I think, St. Teresa of Avila has an image of hell that I think is really kind of frightening and we can relate to. She says that she led sort of a worldly life, even when she was in the convent. They didn't have TV or radio then, and she had this very engaging personality. So everybody in town would come by the parlor at night so that Teresa could entertain them. And anyway, so she was, very in the convent. She was kind of a worldly a woman. Well, after her conversion, Jesus gave her a vision of the place that was reserved for her in hell. And she walked down this long corridor, and there was filth on the floor and screaming and yelling in the background, all the torments of hell that you would imagine. And she gets to this wall, and there's a carved out box. And her guide says, that's where you go. And she understood that she would have been in that box, in this wall, for all eternity. For someone who's claustrophobic, that's horrible. Let me tell you, elevators make me nervous. But that's horrible. But she said that the worst suffering that she experienced was the spiritual suffering that she had, the loneliness, the pain. And I think that all of us can relate to that in our lives. We, like I was talking about how we suffer from depression and loneliness in our society. And I think all of us experience that. But if you think about it, the only reality is God. God is the creator of all things, and He is what is real. If you push away from God, you're pushing into nothingness or chaos. So if you're with God, you are joined in the Trinity, in the unity of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. If you are pushing away from God through mortal sin, which is that's your ticket to hell, if you push away from God in mortal sin, you're going to be isolated and alone, which to me, that would be the worst torment of hell. Several of the other saints have said that one of the great torments of hell is the regret, because you will have seen in the Last Judgment, you will have seen God and how beautiful and wonderful He is, but you would have fled from Him because you knew that you couldn't stand in His presence. And the regret over what you had done in your lifetime, and then you're in that isolation, that loneliness. So it's good to consider, not to dwell on hell necessarily, but it's good to consider the last four things, because those are the realities. All this stuff in our lives, it'll all pass away. I was at it's not a nursing home, but an assisted living facility today. A friend has cancer, and they've put him on hospice. He's not on. He's on a ventilator. He's got the breathing tube, but he's not in pain. I asked him. I said, "How do you feel?" And he was getting up and walking around and stuff. And he said, he's 95. And he said, "Well, I'm tired, but I am 95." And I said, "Well, are you in pain? And he said, no, not really, not really. But he knows he's dying. And the hospice people have told him that he really doesn't have long to live. If he lives the week, they might be surprised. Now, he's an ornery old cuss, so he might do it just to spite people, but he recognizes that he's going to die. And so we talked about God. I told him that if he made it to purgatory, like I said, he's an ornery old cuss. So I said, if you make it to purgatory, I want you to pray for me and my family. And he said, okay, and you pray for me. And I said, okay, we will. And anyway, we all, all the stuff that he's done in his life, none of that really matters. When it comes down to it, it's going to be an encounter between you and God. And what I hope is when I die, Jesus will turn to me like he turned to St. Dismas. You know who St. Dismas is? I see some heads bobbing. There are a lot of people who don't know who St. Dismas is. He was the good thief. And Jesus said to him, today you will be with me in paradise. So I hope that is Jesus' words to you as you enter into eternal life. God bless and thank you for your time.